Hello and welcome to episode number 12 of Bicep for Real. Getting towards the end of this course now, we've got most of the resources we need deployed and running. If we have a look at our digital stores project that we're looking at, the Lambda Toys project, and we have a look at our resources, we've got all of those deployed and running. We have a look at our requirements, we can have a quick look through there, and we've pretty much met all of those requirements. So we are well on the way to having this project wrapped up and ready to go. So this week we are going to just take up a piece of work to look at how we can actually do things better. And in particular, how can we take what we've already written and redesign it to be a bit more modular and reusable so that we don't have to replicate code in our project. So this will become a bit clearer when we look at the example. So if we hop on over to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to have a look at our infrastructure, and we're going to have a look at the core Bicep file. And if you remember, this is where we deployed some of the key resources, the network, the Cosmos DB, and so on. And one of the things we deployed in here was private link, so private endpoint, sorry. So private endpoint to allow us to join the Cosmos DB to the virtual network and access that over a private IP address. That all works fine. But what we didn't do is we didn't join any other things to the network. So we now have a requirement where actually we've realized we need to access the key vault using private link as well. So we create the key vault in here somewhere. He says, there we go. Yeah, so we create the key vault here, but that's just being accessed over the internet. So what we could do is we could just copy and paste all this code. So this is the code that creates a private endpoint for Cosmos. We could just copy and paste that, change some values, stick that at the end, and that'd work. But now we've got duplication of code. If we get, let's say there's a new version of the private endpoint Bicep code that comes out and we want to update it. Now we've got to update it in two places. If we have a change in our standards, we've got to update it and so on. So this is where we can make use of modules. So modules allow us to extract out this code into a separate resource that we can then pull in multiple times and use within our code to actually create the resources without duplicating the code. So let's go ahead and create a module for this. So the first thing I'm going to do is just copy this code because we're going to use this as the basis for creating our module. Now let's go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to call it modules. And then in there, we're going to create a new file called private endpoint bicep. Okay. Now, a module file in Bicep is just another Bicep file. There's nothing special about it. And actually, most of the magic comes in using the module than it does in creating it. So let's first up go ahead and paste in the resources. Now, this obviously isn't going to work as is. Firstly, we're missing a load of properties that were in our original file that we're going to have to make sure we add in. But also, this is obviously specific to Cosmos, so we're going to need to make this a bit more generic as well. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to build our interface. So how are people going to send information into this module? And we can base that initially on the actual things that are missing. So things like, example, we know we are going to need a name for the private endpoint and all the resources that go along with it. Now, we don't just want to replace prefix because this is specific to Cosmos. We want to have the customer or the consumer even of the module pass us most of that information. Let's start this. So our interface is done through parameters as normal. So we're going to do a parameter called name. It's going to have type of string, and that's what we're going to use for this. So now what we can do is we can actually change this over to be name. We don't want this Cosmos bit because that's specific to that. So we're going to assume that the customer is going to pass that bit in. So the name will include that. So we're just going to do that. We need to suffix it with something because obviously these resources all have different names. So we'll go ahead and we will reuse that here. Same for this, same for that. And that should do that. Okay. So that's the first piece. Second thing we can see, we are going to need a location. So let's add that as a value as well. Now, some of these are global. We don't really care about those, but it's this particular one here that I'm concerned about. So we covered that. Next, we need some information on the virtual network that it's going to be joined to. Now, let's have a quick check. Is it just the ID we need? So we also need a subnet as well. Okay, so it's just the ID of the network and the subnet. So we have to add two parameters for that. So it's one called network ID, that's a string. And then we'll also add one called subnet name, which is a string as well. So we can then go ahead and say that's going to get replaced with that. Now this one is slightly trickier. what it's actually going to be. This original value here was actually pulling it out of the virtual network object. We don't have the virtual network object in this module. We don't really want it because it's more than we need. So we're just going to construct the ID for the subnet, which is pretty straightforward. We just need to do virtual network ID / subnets / subnet name. And it helps if we use the right quotes. Clean that up. There we go. That's just sort that out. Okay, so that's got most of the sort of naming networking piece. The next bit is obviously that we need to genericize some of this stuff around what the private link is for. So the first thing here is the private link service ID is the ID of the resource the private link is going to be attached to. So let's create that one. That's fairly straightforward. It'll be a string. And then we can use that in place of that. Do we need this anywhere else? No. And then we also need the sub-resource ID. Or name, sorry. So we're going to call that sub resource types assistance. And that's actually going to be an array because you can have more than one of those. So we're going to have to replace this whole section here with this value. That's fine. That'll all work. The last bit then is DNS. So we need to create a DNS zone. We need to know what the zone name is. So we'll add that in here. So the name of the zone is going there. And we should also have that up here as well, where we create the zone. And this creates the DNS zone. This links the zone to the private endpoint. And I think that should do it in terms of properties or parameters. Now, we need to make it a bit more generic now in terms of the resource names. So these names in here, they're not actually used by anything, but obviously it's going to be confusing if somebody comes in and looks at this module and sees that it's they all relate to Cosmos. So let's change this to, let's make sure it's clear that it's the zone. And obviously we're going to have to fix any references to it, which is there. Make that the link. Make that just private endpoint. And we can make that. There we go. Now, obviously, some of these are now going to be invalid. So let's fix these up. Okay. And that should then work. The last part we need to create is the other side of the interface, which is around any outputs we want to deliver from the module. So because this is happening in a separate module, previously when we did it in line, we could reference any of the properties we wanted to. This is now happening in a separate module, and actually under the hood, this is actually an ARM template nested template. We need to specify any outputs that we want to be able to use in the rest of the template. So there's probably a couple of things that we should I think will be useful here. So we're going to want the actual ID of the private endpoint, and that's going to be private endpoint.id. We also probably want the DNS zone ID. We're going to call that private endpoint DNS zone.id as well. So that'll give us those two if we need to reference them anywhere else. So you can see that here, actually nothing in here is any different from what we've done previously with writing a Bicep template. The only difference is that we've been a bit more strict about defining what our interface through the inputs and outputs are. So where it really becomes useful is when we want to use this. So if we hop back to our core template, and we'll leave the Cosmos one for the minute, but we're going to use the key vault. So we're going to say here we want to create a module. So it's different to a resource, it's a module. And we're going to call it key vault private link. And the actual resource is going to be in a folder that's above this. So we need to do a relative path to modules. And we need to remember to wrap it in quotes. Stick there. And yeah, private endpoint bicep. So that's the path to the actual module file. And then within the actual module, we can give it a name. This is the name just given to the module itself. So it doesn't actually get used for much other than the name of the deployment that happens within the ARM fabric. So nothing, that doesn't really matter. The key bit here is the parameters section. And in here is where we pass in our parameters that we talked about before. So we're going to call the name we're going to give this is the one that we told we're going to pass in and then add some things to the end of. So we're going to call this, we're going to use our prefix option again, and then we're going to call it key vault, and that's what we're going to leave it as. The rest will get appended to the end for us. We are going to set the virtual network to be vnet virtual network.id, the subnet name. How did we do that previously on here? We got it from there, but that's not going to work. So let's just quickly check our virtual network. And what we can do basically is do the same as we did here. So this basically looks at the VNet and finds the first subnet and gets the ID of it. So we're going to use that down here. We're going to change that to name. So we get the name of the first subnet. The zone name. So for private endpoint, I think we discussed this previously, but we need to go and have a look at the list of DNS names that you can use for private endpoints, which will give us those zones and the resource type. So this is that website. There's a whole list here. We want Vault. There we go. So we know that the zone is private link.vaultcore.azure.net and the resource type is Vault. So that's what we're going to use over in our template. So the zone name is going to be that. The sub-resource type is going to be Vault. And the resource ID is going to be keyvault.id because that's referencing the key vault we've already deployed. This is giving us an error because obviously it needs to be an array, as we mentioned before. So let's fix that up. And that is it. So this is really where the special bit, you've got this new module resource type, and that's going to go ahead and reference a file wherever the module is. There are other ways to reference these. We're going to have a look at one of those in a minute, but for the minute, we're just going to reference it in the file. And this is going to go and send those properties in, and we're going to run everything that's within that module file. So you can see that's much simpler than the sort of list of here. It's of abstracting all that away. And so what we will actually do is we will go and copy and paste this, and we're going to also replace the Cosmos one to make that simpler to read as well. Except we're actually going to copy and paste the right thing, which is actually the private link module, not the key vault itself. So we're going to call that Cosmos private link. Got to spell Cosmos correctly. Step there. Now a lot of this is going to be the same. We want to change the name to that. The network ID is something that's the same. The DNS zone is going to be different. And we could have actually taken that from up here. Put that in there. And the resource type, we can again look here, is SQL. Is that upper or lowercase? Copy that. And we're changing this to the Cosmos DB account.id. I think that's right. I think that's the Cosmos DB account. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So what we should now have is all of the right information in there, which check we do. So we can now get rid of all of this. Okay. And so that's much simpler to read. So modules are useful for reuse and those sort of things, but sometimes they're even useful if you just want to simplify a complex resource and hide some of the complexity from your top level module, top level template. So they can even be useful just for that, even if you're not planning on reusing them. So that's done. We're going to go ahead now just quickly and test that out and deploy it. I'll come back to you with the deployment so we can just have a quick look at that. Okay, so our deployment's completed. That's run through it, and you can see now if we organize these by type, we've got, if we go look at the private link, there's the network card, and for each for Cosmos and Key Vault, and you can see the DNS zones, and you can see the private link pieces. That all work fine. One additional piece when you start using modules, if you go look at the deployment, ignore the ACA error, that's from a previous deployment, but you can see here the Cosmos private link and the Key Vault private link are actually called out into separate deployments here because they come from a module. So similar to if they're in a separate file, in fact, calling a file like we did there previously is pretty much the identical process. And then we go and look in that, we can actually see the individual steps for those particular resources. So that all worked as expected, and we are good to go there. Now, there's one last piece I want to look at, which is storing this module in a repository. So at the moment, we've got this module stored in the modules folder. It's accessible to any file within this project, but if anybody else wanted to use this, so we've got other teams or we want to use it within a different project, they wouldn't be able to. Now, there are multiple ways that we could deal with that, getting into a point where we can distribute this to users. You could just put it in a Git repo, and you could have various teams download those files and integrate them into their projects. That would work absolutely fine. But there is also another way, which is to store these in a module repository. So this is a way of storing them in a central location that makes it easy to consume. You don't have to check out a Git repo or anything. You can actually just pull them straight from the repository. And there are actually two ways to do this. There is something called template specs, which was a slightly older method, which was designed to hold ARM templates, but can also be used with Bicep as well. I'm going to suggest not using that here just because it is slightly older and the newer approach is better, which is to use a Bicep Module Repository, which actually stores the module within an Azure Container Registry. So Azure Container Registries are now actually not just for containers. They meet the OCI spec for just storing lots of different objects, one of which is Bicep modules. So we can store and publish our modules into a container registry, and then we can consume them in our code without having to make sure we download a file or anything. So let's have a look at how we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so we're over at the command line. Before I've done this, what I've gone and done is deployed an Azure Container Registry. Nothing special about it, just deployed a standard Azure Container Registry. And the only thing we need to do is make sure we go and retrieve the name or the login URL for that repository, because we're then going to run a command. So we are in the root of our project folder. You can see that there, and we've got that modules folder here. And we're going to run this command. So there's a Azure CLI command, publish AZ bicep module. And what you do is you point it at the actual path to the file. So this is modules for the private endpoint of biceps. That's the actual file on our disk. And then the target is telling it with the container registry to go to. So there's a couple of things to unwrap here. The first is you prefix it with BR : to indicate this is a bicep registry. Let me zoom in a little bit here. To indicate it's a bicep registry. Then you give it the name of the actual container, and then you give it a path to some. These are just folders, and you can really call these what you like, how you want to organize them. And then the name of the actual module. Again, call it what you want, but obviously it needs to be something sensible. And then colon the version number. So you can version these modules. So when you consume them, you can use a particular version. So if we go ahead and run that. That should publish our module to the Bicep registry, and it will take a minute. You also need to make sure that you're logged in, which I may not be. Okay, so the problem here is that ACR doesn't like having camel case, so that actually needs to be private endpoint with a lowercase e. So let's try that again. Hopefully you seeing my silly mistakes is actually useful and it helps you learn from when I make problems. Okay, yeah, so here we go. That's published it. It's done a bicep compile and it's complaining for some reason about this type. I don't know why, but it's not really a big issue here. So what we can do now is we can hop back to the Azure portal and let's just go look at the registry. So this is the registry I created to hold these. And if we go have a look in repositories, this will be showing us now this module. So this is our module we just published. There's an older one I've got in here called the storage one we're not using. If we click on that, you can see there is a V1 of that. Click on that, and you can actually come in and see the information about it. And if you click on the artifact, I know you don't get any information. There's no way actually here, as far as I know, to actually see the content of the module. No, that just gives you the sort of information about it. But you can see it's published it, and it's here, and it's ready to be consumed. So back in Visual Studio Code, if we want to switch our module from using the path locally, we want to switch that over to using the module in the repository, we just need to change this path option here from the local path to the registry. And this is exactly the same string that we used when we actually published the module. Now, I'm not sure why VS Code is complaining about it unless it needs to be updated to deal with these. We'll have a look and see if I've broken something in a minute. So we'll do the same thing with Key Vault. Point at that. We're going to publish our changes onto a branch. So we've got a test branch here we're using for this. So add module repo. Okay, we push that up. Now we want to do a test deployment and see if that actually is working or if that underline there actually does mean something. So what we're going to do is we are going to go over to Azure DevOps and run it. Let me just show you how to run things off a branch, which might actually be useful for you in the future. So we've got our pipeline here, and we can come in and we can click run pipeline. And by default, that's going to run off the main branch. Our changes are not on the main branch, so we want to come in here, drop this down, and we want to pick modules, which is the branch I've got set up for this. I'm also going to tweak it slightly so that when we go to on stages to run, it shows us the dev test prod option. I'm not going to run it in test and prod because this is all about just testing out a release. I don't want to push it all the way through. I just want to make sure it works. So we're going to use selected stages, and we're going to hit run, and let's see that through, and hopefully that will still work. It should be very quick because if everything's worked, there's no changes to make. We've just changed where the module is. So let's just wait for that to finish. Okay, so that did fail. I had actually made a mistake, and it was probably an obvious one that most of you picked out. If we hop back to VS Code, the reason here is when we pasted this change, we didn't fix the change that we put in before to put a lowercase e in. So absolutely should have paid attention to Visual Studio and why it was complaining. It's my own fault, so let's just push that. And we'll run this again. Now, one nice feature here is if you actually have the failed job and you go run new in the failed job, all of the settings that you define there with the module and the stages, apparently not the stages, but the module will, the branching will already be there for you. So let's just run that through again, and hopefully this time it will work. Okay, so that deployment has completed successfully. Everything's deployed, everything looks exactly the same as it was before, but now our modules are stored on that module repository and are usable from any project we want to consume them from. So you can go quite a long way with that. If you want to build a really complex central repository of modules with lots of different options that people can consume, you can have build pipelines to actually publish your modules, you can test them, all the stuff we've looked at previously with the actual implementation code, you can do with modules. And if you want to start doing those sort of things, absolutely go to town if you want. That is it for today, and as I said, that's probably going to be mostly it in terms of what we actually need to create and deploy for this whole project. We're going to have one more video. We're going to have a look over what we've done, summarize it up, next steps and those sort of things. So that'll be next week's video, and then that will be the end of this course. So hopefully I'll see you for that last session, and have a great rest of your day.